I grew up in rural Alabama, about 50 miles from Montgomery, outside of a little place called Troy. We would visit the little town of Troy, visit Tuskegee, where Tuskegee University is located, visit Montgomery, 50 miles away. I saw those signs that said white men, colored men, white women, colored women, white waiting, colored waiting. We would go to the theater. All of us little black children had to go upstairs to the balcony, and all the little white children went downstairs to the...
They told you slavery ended in 1865. They told you equality was written into the Constitution. They told you black people were free. But they never told you what came next. Because what followed wasn't freedom. It was a cold, calculated system of terror, built not on chains but on laws, built not in the shadows but in full daylight. It didn't go by the name slavery anymore. It went by something more polite. Jim Crow. Between the late 1800s and the 1960s, America wasn't simply segregated, it was strangled by racial control so extreme, so sadistic, so legally protected, it created a second version of slavery, one that lived in courtrooms, classrooms, jail cells, playgrounds, graveyards, and even lunch counters. And yet it's rarely taught. That's why we're diving into 10 horrifying facts about Jim Crow that you were never supposed to know. And we're not holding anything back. Let's get started. Number 10. The lie of separate but equal. The phrase sounded almost fair. Separate but equal. 4 little words that gave racism a suit and tie. That turned apartheid into policy. That let America call itself a democracy while openly designing a racial caste system. It all started in 1896. The case was Plessy v. Ferguson. Homer Plessy, a black man in Louisiana, bought a first-class train ticket and sat in the whites-only car. He was arrested. His crime, daring to exist outside the box that white lawmakers had drawn for him. When the case reached the U.S. Supreme Court, America had a choice: end segregation or legalize it. It chose the second. The court ruled that separating people by race was perfectly fine, as long as the facilities were equal. But that was a lie from day one. There was never any intention of equality. The whole point of segregation was to make sure white people stayed on top and black people stayed beneath them, economically, socially, spiritually, and legally. That ruling gave birth to a monster. From that moment, Southern lawmakers raced to pass a tidal wave of segregation laws, each more absurd than the last. Separate schools, separate hospitals, separate train cars, restaurants, elevators, waiting rooms, cemeteries, and even Bibles used in court. In Atlanta, judges kept 2 separate Bibles, one for white witnesses, one for black ones, because apparently even divine truth couldn't be shared. In North Carolina, black and white students were required to use different sets of textbooks, and Florida went a step further, banning even the storage of those books in the same building. It was as if information itself had to be segregated. In Birmingham, Alabama, black and white residents weren't allowed to play dominoes together. Yes, dominoes. The same city made it illegal to share billiard tables, poker games, or even public parks. In Oklahoma, separate telephone booths were required because somehow using the same receiver could damage the social order. But behind the ridiculousness was cruelty, real cruelty. Black schools were routinely underfunded, with crumbling walls, no heat, outdated books, and overcrowded classrooms. Hospitals for black patients had fewer beds, lower budgets, and no emergency services. In transportation, black passengers were often forced to stand or sit near bathrooms, even if the colored section was full. And if you complained, you could be arrested, or worse. Segregation wasn't just about separation, it was about humiliation. Every law was a reminder that you were seen as less. Every sign that said colored didn't just direct traffic, it whispered, "You're not welcome. Stay in your place. Don't forget where you stand." Number 9. Ballots burned, how black votes were erased. If Jim Crow could keep you out of the schoolhouse, it would. But if it couldn't, it had a backup plan: keep you out of the ballot box, because a segregated school was one thing, but a black man holding a vote, a black woman shaping power, that was revolutionary. And revolutions to white supremacists had to be crushed, so they crushed them with paperwork, poll taxes, lies, and lynchings. Let's rewind. After the Civil War, the 15th Amendment had one clear promise: the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Sounds good, right? But by the 1890s, white lawmakers across the South had found a way to kill that right without ever touching it directly. They didn't need to repeal the amendment. They just buried it under layers of impossible rules. They started with poll taxes, forcing black voters, most of them poor sharecroppers, to pay just to cast a ballot. In states like Georgia and Alabama, if you couldn't pay the tax every year, even retroactively, you lost your right to vote. Then came the literacy tests. Ostensibly designed to ensure informed voting, they were nothing more than traps. A white man might be asked to read a simple sentence. A black man might be handed a multi-paragraph legal document and told to explain the entire state constitution from memory. If he hesitated, he failed. If he succeeded, they changed the rules. And if you passed the literacy test and paid the poll tax, they had a grandfather clause waiting. It said that only those whose grandfather had voted before the Civil War could skip the test. Guess what? No black person's grandfather had that right. In other words, you could be brilliant, educated, fluent in law and politics. But if your skin were black, you were politically extinct. The effect was swift and devastating. In Louisiana, there were over 130,000 registered black voters in 1896. Just 8 years later, in 1904, only 1,342 remained, a 99% collapse. Number 8. Swearing to inequality. If Jim Crow stripped black people of the vote, it also stripped them of something just as sacred: the right to justice. And it didn't stop with who sat on the jury, or who gets to be a judge. It went deeper, to the very ritual of truth itself. Under Jim Crow, even the courtroom, that temple of fairness, truth, and law, became a theater of white supremacy. It didn't matter if you were the victim or the witness, the innocent or the accused. If your skin were black, your voice would come second, or not at all. So when a black man was sworn in to tell the truth, he didn't just face his accusers. He faced a ritual humiliation built into the very foundation of the courtroom. It told the jury, the judge, and the gallery that his words carried less weight, that even his oath needed a lesser version of sacredness. In some counties, this wasn't just tradition, it was written into court procedure. Entire legal systems operated under the unspoken rule that black witnesses were inherently less credible, no matter how articulate, educated, or sincere. If a case came down to a black person's word against a white person's, the verdict was already written. That bias had deadly consequences. Black people falsely accused of crimes, especially of offending white women, were regularly convicted on the flimsiest testimony. No evidence? No problem. All it took was a white finger pointed in rage, and the courtroom machinery would do the rest. And if a black defendant wanted to bring forward black witnesses in his defense, good luck. Their statements were questioned, their grammar mocked, and their dress criticized. Their memory was unreliable. Their motives were suspicious. Their tone was too confident. That wasn't justice. That was a lynching in slow motion, wrapped in legal paperwork. Meanwhile, white defendants who stood trial for crimes against black victims, even murder, could count on all white juries to deliver not guilty faster than it took to pour a drink. Number 7. Slavery by another name. Once the courtroom slammed its door, the story wasn't over. It was just beginning. For thousands of black Americans during the Jim Crow era, a guilty verdict didn't mean prison the way we understand it today. It meant slavery. repackaged, rebranded, and completely legal. This wasn't some hidden operation. It wasn't underground, it was out in the open, written into law, managed by the state, and drenched in profit. It was called convict leasing. The loophole had always been there, tucked neatly into the 13th Amendment. The same amendment that supposedly abolished slavery made one tiny exception, quote, except as a punishment for crime. And that was all Jim Crow needed. That single line became a golden ticket for Southern states looking to rebuild the plantation economy after the Civil War. No more overseers, no more auctions, just courts, jails, and chains. Here's how it worked. Black men, often young, often poor, were arrested en masse on vague or completely invented charges. Loitering, vagrancy, talking too loud, walking without purpose. In some towns, unemployment itself was criminalized and only enforced against black people. Once arrested, they were handed outrageous fines. Couldn't pay, welcome to the system. Instead of housing them in government prisons, states leased them out to private companies, coal mines, railroads, brickyards, turpentine camps, cotton plantations. The companies paid the state for the bodies, and the state pocketed the money. No trials, no rights, no end date. In Alabama alone, convict leasing became a $1 million a year industry by the early 1900s, a fortune at the time. Alabama's entire prison system was so profitable it didn't cost taxpayers a dime. The inmates paid for it with blood. And what were the conditions like? Unimaginable. Men were chained together, forced to sleep in cages, and worked to exhaustion in scorching heat and freezing rain. Food was scarce. Medical care was a joke. Whippings were constant. Escape meant death. Speaking out meant worse. The companies had no reason to care. After all, these weren't workers. These were disposable bodies. If one died, the state would send another. In 1873, nearly 25% of all leased convicts in Alabama died in a single year. That's not a prison, that's a slaughterhouse. Children weren't spared either. Boys as young as 12 were shackled and sent into the mines. In some camps, guards staged gladiator-style fights between prisoners for entertainment. Others buried the dead in unmarked graves just out of sight of the railroad tracks. This wasn't a glitch in the system. This was the system. Number 6. Red Summer, 1919. They had survived the fields. They had endured the chains. They had returned from the trenches of Europe wearing the uniform of a country that barely acknowledged their humanity. And for one brief moment, it looked like change might finally be possible. But in 1919, America showed black veterans and their communities exactly how it felt about black pride. It burned it to the ground. The First World War had ended. Thousands of black soldiers returned home, not just with medals on their chests, but with a new sense of dignity. They had fought for liberty abroad, risked their lives for a country that had enslaved their ancestors. And now they came home expecting something small, a little respect. They didn't get it. Instead, they walked back into a country trembling with white fear. Fear that black men, armed with discipline, confidence, and a global view, would no longer tolerate the leash. White mobs didn't wait for these veterans to raise their voices. They struck first. What followed was one of the most savage, coordinated outbreaks of racial violence in American history. They called it the Red Summer. Not for communism, but for blood in the streets. Between the spring and fall of 1919, white mobs launched violent attacks in over 25 cities and towns across the country. Not just in the South, but in northern cities like Chicago, Washington, D.C., Omaha, and Philadelphia. Anywhere black progress had taken root, fire followed. These weren't random riots. These were organized pogroms. White mobs chasing down black residents, looting their homes, destroying black-owned businesses, and murdering indiscriminately. In many places, police stood aside. In others, they joined in. In Chicago, the spark was a teenage black boy, Eugene Williams, who accidentally drifted into the whites-only section of Lake Michigan while swimming. He was stoned to death. No one was arrested. But the aftermath? 7 days of chaos. White gangs stormed black neighborhoods, torched homes, and beat every black person they could find. By the time it ended, 38 people were dead, 23 black, 15 white, and over 500 were injured. In Washington, D.C., black veterans fought back. Armed with pistols, they organized neighborhood patrols to defend their families. For the first time, white mobs met resistance, and it stunned the nation. But the violence still raged for days. And then there was Elaine, Arkansas, maybe the most brutal of them all. There, black sharecroppers had dared to meet and organize for fair cotton prices. They were tired of being cheated, tired of being poor. So they gathered in a small church to form a union. That night, white men ambushed the meeting. A gunfight broke out. One white man was killed. The next morning, hundreds of white men, joined by U.S. Army soldiers, invaded the area. They hunted black families through fields and forests, burning cabins, shooting men, women, and children alike. Estimates of the dead vary. Official reports claimed around 20 black deaths. Historians now believe it was more than 200. And just to twist the knife, 12 black men were arrested and sentenced to death for defending themselves. It took years of appeals to save their lives. But that was the pattern. Over and over again, across America. Black ambition sparked white aggression. Black success was seen as black rebellion. Black dignity was met with white terror. Here's a quick reminder, please like, share, and subscribe to Black Culture Unlocked for powerful black news, real stories of our heroes and leaders, and the rich culture and history the world tried to forget. Number 5. Tulsa, 1921. Out of the terror of 1919, something remarkable happened. Black America didn't just recover, it rose. In the heart of Oklahoma, a community flourished, one that didn't just survive Jim Crow, it thrived despite it. This wasn't a shanty town, it wasn't a charity project. It was Greenwood, a neighborhood in Tulsa where black doctors owned clinics, black lawyers ran offices, and black families walked proudly on sidewalks they built themselves. It was called Black Wall Street. And in 1921, white America burned it to the ground. Let's go back. Greenwood wasn't an accident. It was built by black people who had escaped the Deep South, determined to create something of their own. They built barbershops, grocery stores, libraries, luxury hotels, newspapers, nightclubs, and theaters. It had its schools, post office, and airport. At its peak, money circulated 30 times before leaving the community, a level of economic power unheard of in black neighborhoods at the time. But prosperity in black hands? That was unforgivable. All it took was a rumor. On May 30th, 1921, a 19-year-old black shoeshiner named Dick Rowland entered an elevator operated by a young white woman, Sarah Page. Something happened, no one knows exactly what, but when the doors opened, she screamed. By the next morning, white newspapers ran with headlines like "Nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator." The implication was clear, the dog whistle had been blown. A white mob gathered at the courthouse demanding Rowland's lynching. But Greenwood didn't stand by. Black veterans, men who had survived World War I, showed up armed to protect him. They had seen what happened in Red Summer. They weren't going to let it happen again. Then came the spark. Someone fired a shot. No one knows who. But in that moment, everything ignited. Not just the guns, but years of white resentment, hatred, and jealousy. White mobs, many of them deputized by local law enforcement, stormed Greenwood. They came with rifles, torches, and even private airplanes, which dropped incendiary bombs onto homes and businesses. Yes, airstrikes. On American citizens. On U.S. soil. In 1921. Block by block, Greenwood was set ablaze. 35 city blocks gone. Over 1,200 homes reduced to ash. Black families were shot as they fled. Some were herded into makeshift detention centers at the fairgrounds and convention halls. Others simply vanished, their bodies never found. Number 4. No schools for black kids. If they couldn't burn your town, they'd burn your future. And if they couldn't kill your business, they'd kill your child's chance to dream. That's how Jim Crow survived. It evolved, from mobs to mayors, from torches to school boards. By the 1950s, white rage had changed costumes. It wore a tie. It sat on school committees. It signed paperwork. And with the stroke of a pen, it shut down entire classrooms just to keep black children in the dark. No place proved this more than Prince Edward County, Virginia. It was a quiet, rural county, mostly tobacco fields and tight-lipped politicians. But in 1951, something revolutionary happened. Black students stood up. Led by 16-year-old Barbara Johns, they staged a walkout at the all-black Moton High School. Their school was overcrowded, underfunded, and crumbling, with no cafeteria, no gym, and tar paper shacks as classrooms. Meanwhile, white students nearby enjoyed pristine facilities. Barbara and her classmates demanded a real education, not separate, not inferior, equal. That protest led directly to Brown versus Board of Education, the landmark 1954 Supreme Court case that ruled segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, and in most places that ruling meant gradual integration. But in Prince Edward County, it meant war. White leaders didn't just resist the Supreme Court, they declared mutiny. Instead of allowing black and white students to share a classroom, county officials did something no other American jurisdiction had ever dared to do. They closed all the public schools, all of them. From 1959 to 1964, Prince Edward County operated without a single public school. Not one. For 5 full years, black children had nowhere to learn. No classrooms, no teachers, no books, no desks. It wasn't just neglect. It was a policy, a choice. Even when the schools reopened in 1964 under court order, the damage was done. A full generation had fallen behind. Some kids were now too old to return. Others had never learned to read beyond a 3rd grade level. Number 3, the Little Rock Nine and the Bayonets of Equality. In 1957, in the heart of Little Rock, Arkansas, 9 black teenagers walked directly into that threat and changed history. They were young. The oldest was 17, the youngest 15. But when the call came to integrate Little Rock Central High School, one of the most prestigious all-white schools in the South, they stepped forward. Volunteers, not warriors, just students who wanted an education that wasn't secondhand. But the moment their names were announced, the city erupted. Governor Orville Faubus, desperate to score political points with segregationists, ordered the Arkansas National Guard to surround the school, not to protect the students, but to keep them out. Yes. State soldiers, paid with taxpayer money, were deployed to stop children from going to school. On September 4, 1957, Elizabeth Eckford arrived alone. She hadn't received word of the group's plan to meet elsewhere. So she walked to the front gate in her Sunday best, clutching her books like any other teenager might. But she hadn't met with her classmates. She was met with a mob. Hundreds of white protesters circled her. They screamed. They spat. They hurled racial slurs with such venom, even reporters were stunned. One woman followed Elizabeth for blocks, shouting for her to be lynched. Photos captured her face, not the face of hate, but of pure terror. Eyes wide, shoulders tight. A lone girl against a city full of rage. She never made it inside that day. None of the 9 did. For 3 weeks, the standoff continued. The governor refused to back down. The mobs swelled, and the President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower, watched from Washington, unsure of whether to act. But finally, on September 24th, he made his decision. He sent in the 101st Airborne Division, paratroopers, battle-hardened soldiers, the same unit that had stormed Normandy, now deployed to escort 9 teenagers through the front doors of an American high school. On September 25, 1957, under the protection of armed soldiers with fixed bayonets, the Little Rock Nine walked into Central High. They didn't celebrate. They didn't shout. They just walked. Quietly, carefully, past angry faces, past spit, past hate, into the building that had refused them. But getting through the doors wasn't the end. It was the beginning of another kind of war. Inside, they were kicked, shoved, and taunted. White students spilled ink on their clothes, threw food, slapped them in the halls. Teachers ignored it, sometimes joined in. Ernest Green became the first black student to graduate from Central High in 1958. He did it surrounded by federal guards. But he did it. The rest scattered. Some left the city, some finished school elsewhere. But all of them carried scars. Physical, emotional, permanent. Today they're called icons, pioneers, the Little Rock Nine. Their names are carved into history books. But back then, they were just kids. Kids who faced a hate that most grown men would crumble under. Number 2, Emmett Till. Just 2 years before Elizabeth Eckford was spit on outside Little Rock Central High, a 14-year-old boy named Emmett Till learned what it meant to walk into a Jim Crow town as a black child and never walk out again. He wasn't a rebel, he wasn't a protester, he wasn't holding a sign or marching down a street. He was just a kid from Chicago, with a stutter, a smile, and a suitcase full of jokes and candy, visiting family in Mississippi for the summer. And in Mississippi, innocence meant nothing, not if you were black, not if you laughed too loud, and certainly not if a white woman claimed you disrespected her. It was August, hot, quiet. Emmett had gone to Bryant's Grocery, a small store in the town of Money, to buy bubble gum. Inside was Carolyn Bryant, a 21-year-old white store clerk. What happened next is still debated. Some say he whistled, some say he flirted, some say he said nothing at all. But in the Jim Crow South, the truth didn't matter. What mattered was this: a black boy was accused of acting fresh toward a white woman. 3 nights later, Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam, Carolyn's husband and brother-in-law, showed up at the home of Emmett's great-uncle. Armed, angry, unafraid, they took him, at gunpoint, dragged him from bed, drove him into the dark. For hours they beat him, smashed in his skull, gouged out one eye. They crushed his head until it no longer looked human. Then they tied a 74-pound cotton gin fan to his neck with barbed wire and threw him into the Tallahatchie River. When his body was found days later, it was bloated, mutilated, unrecognizable, except for a ring on his finger engraved with his father's initials. And that's where most lynchings end. Quiet, hidden, unspoken. But Emmett Till's story didn't end there, because his mother refused to let it. Mamie Till Mobley made a decision that stunned the nation. She demanded an open casket funeral in Chicago. She wanted the world to see what racism had done to her son. And people did. Over 100,000 mourners filed past his coffin. Jet magazine published the photo of Emmett's face, swollen, broken, brutalized beyond recognition. The image was impossible to unsee. The scream of his mother became a scream for the country. And then came the trial. It lasted 5 days. The courtroom was segregated. The jury was all white. Witnesses testified. Emmett's uncle pointed to the men who took his nephew, but the defense claimed the body couldn't even be proven to be Emmett's. One juror later said the decision took just an hour and would have been quicker if they hadn't stopped for sodas. Number 1, lynching as spectacle. If Emmett Till's murder exposed the cruelty of racism, it also revealed something far more chilling. That brutality wasn't always hidden. Sometimes it was public. Sometimes it was a party. Long before Till's mutilated face appeared in Jet magazine, before Mamie Till Mobley turned her son's casket into a protest, white America had already spent decades doing the opposite, turning black suffering into a celebration. Because lynching wasn't just violence, it was a theater, and the audience came hungry for blood. Between 1880 and the 1940s, thousands of black people were lynched across the United States, most of them in the South, but far from only in the South. These weren't secret crimes committed under the cover of night. They were scheduled events, organized, advertised, attended. Newspapers printed the time and location. Flyers were passed out like county fair announcements. In some towns, special trains were chartered to bring in spectators. Businesses shut down early so employees could attend. Entire families, from toddlers to grandmothers, showed up like it was a Sunday picnic, and at the center of it all, a tree, a rope, a burning black body. The victims were accused of everything from murder to rape to looking wrong at a white woman. But trials didn't matter. Evidence didn't matter. Most were never even arrested. They were dragged from jail cells or homes or church pews, beaten, tortured, and hanged, sometimes alive, sometimes already dead. And the crowd didn't just watch. They participated. They jeered. They cheered. They took turns striking the victim. Some men carved off fingers and ears as souvenirs. Some brought knives to slash skin from the bone, while others lit matches to start the fire. Photographers were hired to capture the moment. And then came the postcards. Yes, postcards. Photos of lynched black bodies were printed, mass-produced, and mailed across the country with messages like, "This is what happens to troublemakers. This was a great day in town. You should have seen the crowd." They were sold in drugstores, framed in homes, kept in family albums. One image showed a smiling white mob posing around a scorched body, their children looking up like it was Santa Claus, not Satan. It wasn't just brutality, it was branding, a campaign to remind every black person, loud and clear, "You are not safe, you are not equal, and we will destroy you," and laugh about it. And just like with Emmett Till, the legal system did nothing. Coroners claimed victims fell from trees. Sheriffs claimed unknown persons were responsible, even when entire towns had witnessed the murder. White juries refused to indict. White judges refused to speak. And the federal government? Silent for over 70 years. Multiple anti-lynching bills were introduced in Congress starting in the early 1900s. None passed. Not a single one. It wasn't until 2022, yes, 2022, that the United States finally passed a federal anti-lynching law. That's how long it took to say the obvious, that lynching is murder. But for those who lived under its shadow, the damage had long been done. Lynching wasn't just a tool of terror, it was psychological warfare. It told black parents to fear for their sons. It told black children to keep their heads down. It told entire communities to stop dreaming, stop speaking, stop resisting. Because resistance meant death, and death would mean applause. Even today, echoes of this sickness remain. In videos of police brutality that have gone viral. Casually, black pain is consumed as content. How often black death is debated, dissected, and doubted, but rarely dignified. Lynchings may no longer take place in open fields with ropes. But its legacy lives on, in the systems that still devalue black life, and in the silence that still greets black grief. And that's the truth about Jim Crow they never told you in school. It wasn't just about separate but equal. It wasn't just about voting or Bibles or courtrooms. It was about creating a world where black survival was defiance, black success was dangerous, and black existence was always on trial. But the fact that you're watching this video now, the fact that names like Emmett Till, Barbara Johns, and the Little Rock Nine are remembered, means the war for truth isn't over. And this time, people are watching, listening, and they are not silent. If a nation can celebrate torture, silence justice, and bury truth for over a century, what else hasn't it told us? Let us know in the comment section. Do you believe Jim Crow really ended? Or did it just change its name and keep moving? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it, because here we tell the stories no one else will. From ancient African civilizations to modern black excellence, we reveal the truth, the power, and the legacy they tried to erase. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.